Welcome to Pratidhwani, where we try to humanize science. I'm your host, GV Pawan Kumar. It is my delight, pleasure, and honor to welcome a very special guest on Pratidhwani on this particular episode. It is Dr. Chinmay Tumbe. Chinmay is an outstanding academic and an author who has really made waves, especially at the cusp of the pandemics, by bringing out excellent intellectual work, which has also interfaced with the public interest of understanding what migration is and what pandemics are and what they can do and how they actually originated in the context of India and also the world. Chinmay is an associate professor in the economics area at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. And he has varied research interests, including business and economic history, urban and labor economics, migration studies, and various different aspects related to all these areas, what has been mentioned. And he's also author of two outstanding books, which I would want to explicitly mention. One is the India Moving: A History of Migration and the Age of Pandemics from 1817 to 1920. And I had the privilege of also meeting Chinmay when he visited at IISA Pune, and he gave an outstanding talk. So I'm delighted that he's joining on the Pratidhwani. Welcome, Chinmay.
Thank you so much, and so delighted to be here. And I think I'm like a wannabe scientist. So when I get invited to anything, even remotely connected with science, I get very, very excited. So thank you so much.
We consider you as a scientist. Going by the body of work you have, it's an absolute pleasure. Including the recent book of Age of Pandemics really gets into some of the questions where both public health and healthcare also has to learn a lot from this. So Chinmay, one of the aspects of Pratidhwani is also to actually look at the intellectual history of people who generally join on the podcast. Give us a gist of origins of your interests, and how did you really became interested in various questions what you are interested in, right from your beginning, maybe even from your school days, and let us know how it grew.
Yeah, I think the most critical time was definitely school. I was very privileged to go to an outstanding boarding school inspired by the philosophy of Jitta Krishnamurti called Rishi Valley School, which is about 3 hours from Bangalore. And this was like a hippie school, literally. You didn't have exams till class 10. You could just wear whatever clothes you wanted. So very privileged in that sense. But the school was truly remarkable in the sense that you were really allowed to, the whole emphasis was not on rote learning. And just to give you a glimpse of a cohort of about 50, my batchmates, so many of them have done, pure science. In fact, in a batch of 50, I think there are like less than 5 engineers and doctors. And they're biologists, they're astrophysicists, they're sculptors, they're artists. So of course, it's self-selection. I guess parents who put their kids in such a school would come from a particular sample. But having said that, I was exposed to different ideas, and I had amazing teachers of science actually in school, which was very important. But for me, really, schooling and my life till class 12 was all about cricket as a sport. So I used to play for the Chittoor district under 14 cricket team, and after class 10, the school is in fact in class 12, but I switched to Mumbai purely because I had this dream of playing for India. And my father was a cricketer, a professional cricketer until his 30s. We have some other cricketing connections with the Indian team and so on in the wider family. So cricket was a demonstration effect. I just wanted to be a cricketer and play for India. So I actually took commerce and not science, which I really loved. I took commerce because that was the easier way out for cricket. And so I joined, and also because the college in Mumbai, Podar College, was where my father was the captain of the team, some 30 years back. So I joined this Podar College for cricket and commerce. And in 2 years, I realized I was good at neither, in the sense of relative terms. I was not as good as the Bombay cricketers. I mean, I was good in the Chittoor district, but not really good in Mumbai. And I hated accounts. I hated commerce. So my father, said, because that time there was no IPL, so you couldn't really, if you didn't play for India, you didn't, you had to really struggle in cricket. So my father didn't want me to go what he went through. And so he said, if you're reasonably good in academics, just stick to that. So I quit cricket completely. after class 12, which was quite strange because every day of my life until then was about cricket. I would get up, practice, this whole routine with sports. I decided then then I had a bit of soul searching at class 12. What do I like? And I said, I really love mathematics. And my grandfather was a mathematics who, in fact, studied in Russia in the 1950s. So I also had those stories from my mother's side. My father's side was all cricket, and my mother's side had a bit of academics and so on. My mother herself used to teach in schools, colleges, and so on. So I think my starting part was on my father's side of sports, and then eventually everything I've settled down on my mother's side, which is academia. And so my grandfather, who was not really around, I mean, he passed away when I was very small, but maths was always there as a thing in the family because of this connection. And famously in the science circles, I think he was instrumental in teaching maths to his nephew, a certain Jain Narlikar in Pune. So we also grew up with these stories of Jain Narlikar and my grandfather and their interactions and so on. So I said, okay, let me study mathematics and economics, which is also a subject I liked. And so I did my BA. I was the only student in Mumbai University who did BA mathematics and economics. And the only college that allowed that was Ruya College, which was right next to Podar College. So I literally moved down the road in Matunga, Mumbai, to basically study BA mathematics and economics. And I continue to love mathematics, but I really focused on economics after that. And then after that, went to the London School of Economics to do a master's in economics. Flirted with a bit with investment banking, which is maybe a bit of peer pressure. You also need to pay back student loans and so on. So I worked for a year with a very iconic company called Lehman Brothers, which eventually crashed and led to a global financial crisis. But I was there for a year before it crashed. It crashed a year after I left. And this was in between my master's. And then again, I had to make a choice in 2008 to do what to do next. I mean, continue with banking or move to academia. And at that point, I really liked economics. But one of the things that happened at the LSE, the London School of Economics, is that they not only have a department of economics, but also a department of economic history, which is very unique. Otherwise, in an economics program, you might be trained in, you might have a subject called economic history, but they had a separate department altogether. And they used to give like a bachelor's in economic history it's probably the only department in the world which does that. And I audited courses out there. So that was how I got exposed to history and absolutely loved it. In fact, I thought that, you have to understand economics, you really need to know history and so on. But anyway, I then chose to go to Bangalore. So I did my PhD at IIM Bangalore, which now on hindsight, I'm very proud about because there's this whole thing between foreign PhDs and Indian PhDs in, I think, all disciplines. And now I'm very proud of the fact that, I'm an Indian PhD, so to speak, though, of course, I did my master's abroad. But I chose IIM Bangalore partly because of personal reasons. My girlfriend, later wife, was in Bangalore. So I just said, okay, what is there to do in Bangalore? And this seemed to be a great option. So I did my PhD in economics, but the subject I chose then was migration. And migration became an abiding theme for the next 10 years of my life. How do people move? What is the economic impact of that, social impact of that, both internal migration and international migration? I had a fantastic PhD supervisor who also gave me the leeway. So my first year PhD, the thesis was loosely titled Essays on Remittances, the money that people send back. And by the time I graduated, it was called Migration and Remittances in India, Historical, Regional, Social, and Economic Dimensions. And I think the impact of schooling was to just read across disciplines, read literature, read fiction. So I tend to read a lot. And I think during PhD, I really loved this idea of doing interdisciplinary research, which in my case meant roughly at the intersection of economics, history, and demography. And I think that's the connecting theme then, which then led to a book on migration in 2018, and then eventually a book on pandemics in 2020. They seem like very different subjects, but they're actually both at the intersection of economics, history, and demography. So I think that's broadly been the arc of a failed cricketer and then a failed mathematicians. As people say, failed mathematicians become economists, and then maybe failed economists become historians. So I think that's literally how I've reached history, is through cricket, maths, and then economics, and then history. But right now I do a bit of economics, a bit of history, and a bit of demography.
Wonderful, wonderful. In fact, the failure is a relative term. So I would consider that to be almost like an adventure into the new stream.
Absolutely, yeah.
One of the elements of this kind of broad arc is very important, given that you also had interest in sciences and also assuming mathematics. What is the kind of exposure you got? Because in your work, including in your writing, not just the books, I've also just had a look at few papers which I could understand, and it looks that you also tend to have a reasonably rigorous analysis of a lot of information what you process. um, uh, if you look at history, especially written by people who have backgrounds in sociology and other viewpoints, there the narrative is the dominant kind of viewpoint, which is also important. I'm not anyway putting it down, but it's also nice to see the viewpoint of looking at history from slightly more quantitative viewpoint. I see also the similar thing from, let's say, the work of Tirthankar Roy and other people too. Would you want to just comment on that
Yeah.
approach?
No, no, absolutely. I think what you're pointing out is definitely an influence of economics per se, because economics as a discipline is very quantitative. I mean, there's literally nothing now. It's actually unfortunate that
Yeah.
economists today actually simply do not do qualitative research. There are very few economists in economics departments who would do something like and at least in the top journals in economics, there's never been a paper published in the last 50 years which would be something using qualitative research, basic observation. It would be very model based. You get data and check if a model works. So because I've been trained as an economist, I've taken all sorts of courses on and I also did mathematics until my graduation. So I was exposed to the statistics side very well. And I'm not regretting it, because I think it's fantastic to know that. And in history, what you said is absolutely correct. Most historians do archives-based research, which means especially histories of the last 150, 200 years, where you have textual documents. You go, you sit in a library, you sit in an archive, look at old papers, and kind of piece the dots together. For me, I think, so I also love doing that now. In fact, also helped set up an archive, and I'm hugely into this archive space now. But because of this economics training, I love numbers and I love large data sets. I love spreadsheets. I love Excel. I just or the standard software economists use something called Stata. So for the pandemics book, for example, I digitized this whole death statistics from 1860s to 1940s. So that love for numbers comes from economics, because economics tends to be a very quantitative discipline. But my appreciation of history actually comes not because of the numbers, but just because I think it gets a completely different perspective. So I think a lot of my work is a bit different from standard approaches in history, precisely as you said, is because it's slightly more quantitative. And I do think that enables me to give a certain structure. I'll give you just one example before leaving this point. For example, you're writing a book on a century of epidemics, and obviously a lot can be written. Now, what do you choose to write on in 100 years? And the way I went about doing my book is I will first look at the death statistics where available. And if Punjab is more affected by the plague than Madras, then Punjab will get more writing space in my book than Madras, right? So it became like, how do you partition space, time? You need to give more words to certain sections. And for me, the bedrock of that was the statistics. So the statistics influences how much word space then the book gets. So it kind of gives you some structure. Otherwise, you'll end up writing, you might write equally on Madras and Punjab, but we know that Punjab was hugely more affected by the plague than Madras. So it kind of helps you give structure.
That's very, very interesting, because that probably also motivates you to ask certain kind of questions. Because if you are you're already ready with a specific kind of tool and a viewpoint, your framework of questioning would also be associated with that viewpoint. Because it would be difficult, for example, you doing a social history, where your questions are mainly driven by the available data. So would that play an important role in choosing your question? For example, the data what you get guides you to ask a specific question, or do you actually discover a question while actually doing the research?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. And if I just look back at how I tend to do research overall, and especially in history, it is definitely very iterative, right? So I always start with, let's forget about the data. I mean, let's suppose there's no information at all, but what would be a very interesting question? And then, of course, if the data is there, then you're able to kind of get to the question. Just a very simple thing on this age of pandemics. The death statistics start in 1860s, but my book starts in 1817. So I'm on a firmer footing from 1860s, but I have nothing before that. So I still need to write about 40 years before that with virtually nothing to ground me on that. So it's, but there's still some very interesting questions to be asked for that period. And so you don't shy away from it. But broadly, in my research philosophies, never shy away from big questions because there's no data. And I think one of the reasons I've come to this, especially in my world, which is the last 150 years, I'm also now confident that the data must be out there, right? So it's also that what you think does not exist may exist actually, and if only you probe enough, that one day you'll get it. For example, there's no known photograph of the 1918 flu in India, right? I mean, we're saying this is the largest calamity ever. Not a single photograph. I mean, just a shocking kind of a fact. So that's no data. But my sense is that it must be out there, and it's just that I don't know where it exists right now, but someday I'm going to get to it. So I think that's how I've approached blank spots. Start with big questions and try attacking them. And of course, if you have nothing to work with, then you have to be humble enough to say, look, like, I don't know, or we don't know. But I think because of the kind of research that we're doing, and a lot of it is like serendipitous kind of discovery, I have like now some sort of maybe over optimism or overconfidence that the data is actually there somewhere, and it's my job to kind of go hunt it. It's in some archive, library, or some unique kind of a place which is out there. For example, I was looking for first-hand accounts of this influenza pandemic 1918. And I found it literally. There's a book on my shelf in my office which I had not touched until then. It was a memoir of a Maharashtrian lady, and it was right there. I mean, they didn't call it Spanish flu or influenza pandemic. They call it Manmodi, which is a Marathi word. But I corroborated it, and it was definitely it was the same months of September 1918, and what she was referring to was essentially the influenza pandemic. So it was right there on my shelf, like unbelievable. A very rich first-hand account of the influenza pandemic was unbelievably just sitting on my shelf in a book which was a memoir of a Maharashtrian lady, nothing connected with disease or science. So that's what I mean. These chance encounters have given me confidence that maybe it's out there, and it's my job to kind of push it and not shying away from big question.
So if you are looking at such kind of broad perspective, and because of the fact that you also mentioned the iterative process, and that is actually very common even in natural sciences, where you first do an observation sometime, and then you build a hypothesis or some kind of a theory, then go back and check and do things. One of the issues when you do such research is also to make a connection between the abstract and the real. Because you will have to actually somehow go from the stream of knowledge, which is slightly more broader in perspective, to the narrow question of interest, where you may have a lot of data, and sometimes it becomes difficult to really, extract a question out of it, and vice versa too sometimes. So do you also find such kind of issues while doing research? What is your perspective of such kind of?
No, all the time actually. You come across places where you realize it is too broad, and you need to kind of dissect it a little more. And I think like any discipline's research process will come up to some real hard stops where you really don't know how to press forward. I mean, at a project level, I think the way I deal with it is I have a folder called back burner, and the files just go there. And there's a folder called research, and there's a back burner folder. And from time to time, I go there, and I last checked, there's like 60 subfolders up there. So there's 60 ideas which started with a lot of enthusiasm, and they just in the back burner folder now, because you're just stuck. At some point, you just realize you're stuck. And so my process is, if you have an interesting idea, put it out there, put it on paper, collect some stuff, and you start like any project. You start like try and work or attack on this idea or question, and often more often than not, you will get stuck. But I think, again, my process is that put it out there, have a stab at it, and it's okay if you kind of fail at it. Like as I said, failed in cricket, failed in many things in life by now. It's okay if you failed in it, because you, uh, you never know what that might lead to. What I've also found is that projects which have reached complete dead ends have helped me on other projects, because I precisely know, I've learned something from those dead end projects as well. So I guess that's true for all research, especially the sciences, where it's so hard to kind of really come up with something truly original. Um, but that's, I think, broadly what
Okay.
I would describe it.
So it's also a very interesting kind of it's a window to the thinking process itself, because if one needs to actually ask questions, one has to start somewhere, and that usually depends on the influence and also the kind of background reading and also exposure one gets. Because when I was seeing even the references in your books, it actually is based on some of your original papers, where you already had asked these questions in the form of research kind of probably projects. Probably dates back even to your PhD time, especially with the first book. And I can see that seamlessly you've made a very smooth transition from that, research oriented research paper kind of exposition to a slightly more broader perspective. Uh, were you thinking about a book when you were already working on these projects? I mean, I'm just preempting, but
Yeah.
I'm just curious to know what is.
No. So it's a great question. I think the migration book, of course, is based much more on original research than the pandemics book. In fact, I got a critical review on the pandemics book saying, what's new in this book?
Yeah.
And I do think there's stuff new which the review kind of did not see. But there's definitely much more new stuff in the migration book than, I mean, I think all writers, authors, and as academics, we're trained to be self-critical.
Yeah.
We really know, like, okay, what is my value addition in this project? And in migration, chapter 2 is pretty much my thesis, completely different way of looking at migration. But even the migration book has chapters like on partition, where I'm not some great partition scholar, but I've read enough on partition to write something on it. But it's again based on what others have written. So books written in the trade press, because both my books have come out in the trade press, are essentially synthesis works,
Yeah.
which can build on some original research. I mean, the best-selling nonfiction work of the last 10 years is *Sapiens* by Harari. And I don't think there's anything of Harari in there. Like,
absolutely.
this is just synthesis of other ideas, but it works. I mean, there's an appetite for these things. So my idea of doing trade press books now is to do some amount of original research, and then add on to that a lot of synthesis, and kind of get something which works. So there's no doubt that the migration book was based on much more original research. It was also a much longer project. It was a 10-year project which culminated in a book. And the pandemics one came out because I was sitting on a lot of material on epidemics which I'd collected during the migration research, and definitely much more of a serendipity kind of a project than the migration. So it is also the case that the idea to write that book came in Jan 2020 when COVID was first announced. So people asked me, had you already written this book, before COVID? I said, no. Oftentimes, you get an idea because there's an event. So this is clearly a reactive process. But I also knew that the book had to come out in 2020 because, there's no point. So I had the choice to really do an excellent, original, there'll be a lot more of original research in the project if I had come out with the book today, which would be 4 years of solid research, which is what my third book is kind of going to be. It'll be many more years of research. But the pandemics book, I thought, had to come out in 2020, and I knew I had to do a lot of compromises as a researcher. There's going to be much more synthesis than the original. And the original stuff I've done is really the data stuff behind it. So collating that data, especially the estimates on the influenza pandemic. And I think the account of the influenza pandemic is the most original part of the book, because that's really not been written. There have been books on cholera, there have been books on plague, but the influenza pandemic and India in it, I think that's my major contribution in that book. So broadly, I would say for any book project in the trade press, my model of writing now is to do a certain amount of original research. But I don't think any one research paper can carry an entire book. And so that's why there has to be much more than your research. And I just add out here, this is something I did in my PhD. I think one of the skills I've developed is to basically generate very extensive bibliographies,
I
which
can
are
see that.
which are interdisciplinary, including fiction, novels, and so on. And so when I wrote my PhD thesis in 2012, when the defense, happened in the room, none of my supervisors knew I was working on this. I gave my thesis as a bundled report, but I had published a separate 250-page document, bounded,
Wow.
and it was called the India Migration Bibliography. And this had
Yes.
3,000 plus studies on migration, just in the English language, written on India, because I had collected so much of the information on migration in India. And they were just stumped, like there's one thesis document on one side, and then there's a 250-page, literally another compendium. And that's been downloaded a lot of times. Now it's freely available online.
Yes.
And so I feel it's also important for researchers to kind of give back, because when you work, you read a lot, and only some of it gets retained and goes in footnotes or references, but there's a lot more out there. So for both the books, there are extensive bibliographies, and both are freely available online.
I, for people who are listening and also watching this, I would be anyway giving all the references, especially to the website link of Chinmay. I found that fascinating. I was also very kind of fascinated to see the fiction references in many of the stuff what you actually already discussed, and also a very nice kind of a link called HITCH,
Yeah.
which is really worth exploring. I'll be again linking that, where students also do some projects with you, and I'll come to that particular
Yeah.
point in a while. So, kind of taking a cue from what you just mentioned about the synthesis, Chinmay. In fact, if you look at some of the very big books which have come out in the last 10 years or so, or even dating back to, let's say, 20 to 25 years, one, of course, is Harari's book, where there are questions of the synthesis, and also sometimes they question the theme itself, whether a lot of things what are discussed are indeed on a kind of slightly more scholarly level, etc. But there are also two very important books predating that. For example, Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, because Harari himself mentions that he's
Yeah.
vastly influenced by that particular program what Diamond has. And Diamond was actually writing like what you mentioned, to kind of bridge between the scholarly literature and also the slightly more broader one. And also E.O. Wilson, who is also a person who has done this sociobiology and other kind of work. I'm just also interested in knowing this kind of, synthesis actually is a very important component, because in sciences, natural sciences, we also divide this as foxes and hedgehogs, where foxes are really looking at a specific problem from various different angles. Hedgehogs really go into deeper into one particular problem. And there again, in a different form, one also does synthesis of defining questions, etc. Because the value added kind of imperative from both these viewpoints actually is quite high in either way. Is that also the same in, let's say, in business history and also generally the history literature, where the synthesis sometimes actually should get more credit, in my opinion, at least from an outsider perspective? What is your kind of viewpoint on that?
Yeah, I think there are two audiences. There's the academic audience, and then there's just a general audience. It's amazing how academics look down upon trade press books. Right? So academia depends from discipline. But I'll talk about, say, economics and history, two disciplines I know. In economics today, research papers count more than books. And within books, academic press books, say with Oxford University Press or Cambridge University Press, are more valued than, say, trade press books with Penguin or Harper or Rupa and some stuff like that. So that's the kind of the hierarchy, so to speak. And there's some value to it in the sense that it's essentially about peer review. Papers are more rigorously peer reviewed than academic books, and academic books are more rigorously peer reviewed by trade press. And I completely get that. And that's why I continue to publish peer reviewed papers and so on, because I think there is huge value in that. But moving from there to, I meet and interact with a lot of academics who have scorn for so-called popular or trade press books. And I because I myself read both. I mean, I read really detailed monographs and I read research papers, and I benefit a lot from synthesis books because there's a lot of stuff floating out there, and I need, if I want a quick summary of everything, it's useful to have that. And even if I don't agree with it, I will have some starting point, or I'll know what synthesis books do essentially is they tell you that this is the literature. I mean, this is what
Absolutely.
the
Yeah.
field is. A good one, a good synthesis book will tell you what, and you can kind of pick on threads, from there and work with it. So I see the value of synthesis books.
Absolutely.
The one issue I have with history, though, is there are synthesis books across many time periods, right? So like Harari's, of course, like from, like the whole of all of history and so on, or say like William Dalrymple's new book, which is The Golden Road, which is about 1,000 years of Indian history. Now, the issue with this for historians who work on history is that no historian is actually competent on like more than 1 century or 2 centuries max. Like history has like, typically in India at least, there's ancient, medieval, and modern, right?
Yeah.
So, and even within ancient history, people are really experts on like say a band of 200, 300 years and so. Now, so a book like Harari's come along, and the ancient historian will kind of might complain or nitpick, saying, this part on this particular century, like I mean, because the person knows much more about that period, but I love the rest of the book. But the point is, maybe the rest of the book is also equally flawed, or many ways. So it's tough to do critiques with really grand synthesis books because there's no guy who's actually a scholar of all of it.
Absolutely.
So the responsibility then is on the synthesis book writer, right? And I think I just like to put out there that because now I'm in this field of doing synthesis books, I take it as huge like responsibility that on stuff which I'm not really an expert on, I better read everything, present different views, and maybe take a view on that. But I owe it to the reader that I'm not faffing completely on a topic which I'm really not an expert on. And of course, there are, why books do well in the market. There's really no formula for that, I think, especially for synthesis books. But I think synthesis books writers have to take that responsibility that there is really no expert out there who will know all of what they're saying. And so you can, I put this, you can get away by saying anything in a grand synthesis book because there's really nobody who actually knows that whole span of thing. So the responsibility is on the writer. I mean, that's all I'll say. Yeah.
No, this is a very important point. In fact, Jared Diamond's book, Johnson, actually, it's a remarkable book. First of all, I personally I find it very fascinating because the way it is written is actually central point is actually it starts with a question. He calls it Yali's question and other things. But you can see the arc he's also taking through. The second point is that anthropologists actually had a lot of problem there again. There were a lot of because he was looking at the whole question from a geography viewpoint. Whereas people who are interested in sociological aspects and also anthropological aspects did comment and also criticized it. However, I should also mention that some anthropologists came to his kind of rescue and also. So the debate actually is going on. But I found that a very huge amount of academic debates also being actually, motivated by such kind of work, which is actually very, very
which
good,
is remarkable.
Right?
Yeah. Because typically academics will like diss against saying, oh, it's just a popular history or something like that. But you're right, some books can do that. They can really engage. And I think that's the hallmark of a good book, even if you don't really agree with the spirit. For example, I mean, I have to say this because the last week, Asimoglu, Johnson and Robinson, what economists call as AJR, they won the Nobel for economics. Well, not the Nobel, but the Swedish bank in memory of Nobel and so on. But they won the big prize in economics. And their work was essentially a critique of Jared Diamond's. They said, institutions, not geography. And they really went hammer and tongs on that. And finally, they wrote a book. I mean, two of them wrote a book called Why Nations Fail, which is also a great book.
And by the way, I should mention that it's there in Chinmay's reference. I did check, and that probably is right at the beginning, right? When the first top 3 books.
Yeah. I mean, I would, in fact, now that you mentioned it, Jared Diamond's book is not in that list. But I would recommend anyone who wants to know big history of
Yes,
economics and history to read Jared Diamond and then Acemoglu's Why
yes,
Nations
yes,
Fail, and even Harari's Sapien, just to get a sense of this.
absolutely.
I would not. I think these are three big books which have been written in the last 25 years, which I think everyone should read and then see what you make of it on your own. What's really interesting now is that while AJR was completely opposite to Jared Robinson, one of the political scientists, and Jared Diamond, they collaborated on a book. It's an edited volume. Uh,
Yes,
I forget the name, but maybe it came out for 10, 15 years back.
natural experiments. If I'm
Exactly.
correct,
Yeah.
natural
Yeah.
experiments. Yeah,
Yeah.
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 You're right. Yeah.
And that's great because they're completely opposite views, but
Opposite.
that book edited basically different perspectives on again big questions in economics and history, with different folks. And there was another book, I think edited by Pranab Bardhan or Ram Guha many 30 years back, but the title of the book had something like Economists in Conversation with Anthropologists. So
Yeah.
that was a subtitle. So I think that's important. I mean, again, synthesis, and then you get any big book will have a lot of critique. I think that's the obvious thing that should be said. But if that critique can really shape up that field or get completely new ideas, I think that big book would have done that. And you're right, Jared Diamond is one book on those.
Yeah. So the book title is Natural Experiments of History by
Yeah,
Jared Diamond and James Robinson.
James
Yeah,
Robinson.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's yeah. So one more aspect, Chinmay, I wanted to ask is that especially in sciences, people who are also into engineering and even natural sciences, there's also a slow movement towards first of all doing research like conventional any kind of discipline, be it natural or even in humanities or social sciences, do write papers. And what they tend to do is also now an interesting model, which I also kind of endorse, is that the open source kind of viewpoint, where you now have platforms like Creative Commons, where you can put together things and make it even slightly more general, where you synthesize your work by putting them together in a form that is slightly more applicable to a broader audience. And because of the fact that this work is already vetted through peer review, and then make a synthesis which is slightly broader in context. Do you also see that kind of thing happening in social sciences? Because, for example, now there is series of books which are coming out thanks to the Creative Commons platform. Of course, you can now also have print on demand kind of service, etc. But majority of the work propagates, especially in sciences, through online communication. So that is another interesting pathway which is going.
Yeah, I think in the social, I mean, this whole thing called digital humanities. Basically is putting a lot of stuff online. It's not really what you're talking about in terms of Creative Commons and so on. But I think within the broader social science and humanities, I think for all the flack that economics gets, economists, I think, have made almost all their research accessible. Wonderful. Today, if I want to read an economics research paper, I don't even have to go to JSTOR. If it's a living economist, that person will have a web page, and that paper is on the person's web page. Right? It's such a basic thing, actually, when you think of it. And that's why all my papers are freely accessible.
Yes.
It's on Google Drive, and you can just go. That's not the case of sociologists. That's not the case of anthropologists. That's not the case of historians. It's unbelievable.
What a shame. What a shame,
it's
right?
A complete shame. Yeah. Exactly. And I have friends, across these disciplines, and I tell them, why don't you have a website or just some page where, I can access your work? Why do I have to go or edited, chapters in edited books?
Yeah.
And it's a shame that nobody's really putting out there. So I'm aware that obviously in science it's fairly normal, but economics, I must say, as a discipline. And then there's a website called Ideas Repic. It's a massive repository of economics research papers. So economics that way, I would say, is very open-ended in that sense. Having said that, journals are still very, it's like open access journals, or the idea of quick peer review. I think economics is the worst profession right now. So on the one hand, everything is open once it's published, but the publishing times in economics is miserable. It's far worse. I mean, I have a paper in COVID deaths in co-authored, which got published literally within a few months. Because of course it was very topical.
I should mention to the audience, Chinmay is a co-author of a paper which is published in Science. I'm saying this not because of the journal only, but the work is very important because it was related to COVID deaths. And I think it's a outstanding piece of work. And I have to mention that Chinmay is one of the co-authors of that particular paper.
Yeah,
I'll be
so
anyway linking
yeah,
that.
it was a team of again economists, epidemiologists, and so on. And there's the first peer-reviewed paper on COVID deaths in India, which came out in Science in 2022. But I was surprised because that was the first time I was part of a team in a science kind of a journal, and we were getting reviews, within weeks.
Weeks.
And I'm, right. I just got a review last week after a year and a half
Oh my
of like a
God.
econ history journal. I mean, this is something which happened 100 years back, and it's taken me 1.5 years to get a response. So it's quite messed up. But economics in general, and it affects people's tenures and professions.
Yeah,
It's
that's
really
something.
sad because to get published in a top economics journal is literally taking a minimum 5 years. That's just ridiculous. So yeah, so that's a sad part. So I don't really see much of this kind of Creative Commons stuff. It's especially creating new research in economics. In history, I think the digital humanities. So a lot of public archives are coming.
Yeah.
And I must, say out here, my second book would simply not have. One of the reasons I thought the book was feasible to do within a year was because the largest repository of colonial India health documents are freely available online.
Yes.
To see the Wellcome Library collection in the UK and the National Library of Scotland. They have a whole thing called Medical Health of India. And these two public repositories, I wanted to know so the death statistics are digitized, which is basically from PDF report. I mean, I had to put them into spreadsheet, but they're basically reports, freely available online. So in the world of history, I think a huge new thing that's happened is just so much of stuff is online. I mean, historians today can do much more amazing work than just 20 years back, purely because of the amount of stuff that's out there. I'll give you one small example. If I want to see the Times of India of what they wrote in 1890s, right? That's about 100 years back. Earlier, I would go to the Maharashtra State Archives, which is a really bad condition right now. And if I was lucky, after a few days, they won't give you access the same day. And then you ask the archivist, and then the person will ask you which issue you want, right? So I'd say, okay, 8th November 1893. That person will go and get one whole bound file, and then you will get to scroll this particular file. Today, the Times of India has been digitized. From 1838, I can sitting, if I'm at my IIMA, campus, I can access any article, advertisement, classified ad published in the Times of India from 1838 to now. It's ridiculously amazing. I mean, and the Maharashtra State Archives, I could not search for words. Here I can search for words. I can know any article, which was published in the Times of India just by searching words. So it has completely revolutionized history. I mean, getting it out there. And I know economists, I had my first PhD student this year. She basically used this, machine learning kind of an algorithm to train, because if you want to digitize old census documents, the characters are kind of odd. So you can't do simple PDF scans and get them in a spreadsheet. So she basically told the computer saying, this is a 2 and this is a 3 from the old census documents. And she just digitized like over 2 million data points from colonial censuses, and then she analyzed the data. But this is also like history, but using a lot of quantitative stuff. So I think technology has definitely made life simpler for economists and historians, definitely. Yeah.
Wonderful. I'm very glad to actually hear this because, for example, physics, which is my discipline, there's a very rich history of the archive. In fact, archiving with the X actually is something which started very, very early. And now our default option to put our first kind of preprint on archive and then send it to the journals. And in many cases, the journals actually can take the paper directly from archive if you tell them. So it is so streamlined now. Of course, there are some small nitty-gritty issues even there. But overall, this openness actually is something which is kind of strongly encouraged in the community.
It's amazing. And I just say that it's there in economics, but it's not there in the rest of the social sciences. And I should point out again, there are Indian journals, right? And of course, all of them are online. But many of them you can't see back issues even to like 1970s, 1960s. It's sad actually,
It's
because
very sad.
you in the social sciences, definitely you want to know context, you want to know what Indians wrote, 50 years, 60 years back, and you really literally have to physically go to a library and check a library shelf and do that sort of stuff. So I think there's much more that social sciences and humanities folks in India need to do to make their research more easily accessible.
Easy accessible, because there's a wealth of information. Because see, a lot of questions they would have asked would have been very kind of pertinent to the times
Absolutely.
and the
Yeah.
places where they live. Nobody else would have probably asked those questions also. And in
Yeah.
that sense, yeah, it's very. One more aspect, Chinmay, I want to ask is something you mentioned and which I really appreciate is your ability to create this kind of bibliography, and that's usually common among scholars. But one does that slightly more from a focused kind of viewpoint. If you're writing a paper,
Yeah.
or if you are doing, let's say, archival research, you would put together information. But I see that probably this is a project across your whole scientific, or rather, the whole career of right
Yeah.
from even beginning, even predates your PhD maybe. Now, was that a deliberate thing, what you do, or what?
Yeah, I think it really took place during my PhD, because I was just reading so much on migration at that point, and I was coming across so much stuff on migration, and it just hit me then that, what a waste that while I have access to all of this, when I write a paper, I'm citing, say, 50 or 100, papers, but the corpus there is, as I found out, like 3,000. So, others should know about this 3,000. And I must say, I mean, there have been at least a few seminars I've gone to where young, students have said they've not read my papers or books, but they're like, "Thank you for the bibliography." So in some circles, I'm more known for the bibliography and so on. I'm perfectly fine with it, because if it's helping someone do their research, good for them. So I think it took place at the idea of making extensive bibliographies, and the bibliography, the India migration bibliography, has the first 30 pages is literally a catalog. So you want to see it state-wise, city-wise, survey-wise, so it just makes it, it's not just a list of studies. It's something more than that. There's a kind of a logic to it. And again, for the pandemics book, there's a whole 90-page working paper, which has time series statistics on the deaths, an explanation of each of those pandemics, and then of course a bibliography at the end. So I see it as public good creation. So very.
Yeah. So in that way, would you also be kind of archiving it as and when you're actually doing your research, or you sit down first and look at the bibliography available and you go about? How do you go do that?
Yeah, it's a good point actually. I think before writing a book, I would like to, obviously, as you're writing, also you come across a lot of stuff, but I like to understand the broad stuff which has already been written, broadly speaking, on this field. So I think there's a very intensive effort to really understanding the literature. I mean, all of us do literature reviews, but I just say that I try and ensure that it's very interdisciplinary. So the literature review has to cut across multiple disciplines on the topics that I'm studying, and eventually I want that to be seen by the world. So a book, both the books I've written have what I think 500 footnotes, so maybe about 200 studies have been cited, but there are much more which I don't think a book also should have so many. I mean, you can't have the entire thing at the back of a book, so it has to be selective. So what about the rest? And I've figured that, a simple way is just to make a compilation, put it online, and it can help others. So I get emails practically every day on migration in particular, because I think that's where I spend much more time. And I just got one yesterday, or, like a migration internship request. And most of them, I say I can't do it, but I always point the link to my migration resource page saying, there's a bunch of stuff there. Please go there and you can play with it, so to speak. So I've also found that it's useful to direct, especially younger students. Obviously, you can't devote same amount of time to everyone. So have a kind of a page where they can go and play on their own. Because I've benefited a lot by going to people's web pages and just going on. In economics, it's very amazing. Yeah, even the data sets, everything is just freely available now. So you can just plug and play. Yeah,
that's really very nice. which also brings us to the point of some of the things what you do with your students. I see that there are very nice kind of initiatives you've taken, and this is something which is close to a lot of us, where you involve young people in your research. And it's not only about the teaching, but also there is a nice kind of communication which can lead to some new questions too. Because the students themselves would probably look at the question from a different viewpoint. This is something which is underestimated many a times,
Yeah.
especially the undergraduates. There is an element of play in what they do,
Yeah.
and therefore they might actually ask questions which is totally
Totally.
unanticipated,
Yeah.
and a more mature
Yeah.
kind of researcher would miss it out.
Mm.
Tell me a little bit about your
Yeah.
initiatives. I see that Hitch. I'm
Yeah.
anyway linking that.
Yeah.
But tell us some initiatives what you have taken at IIM and
Yeah. So firstly, I actually do not deal too much with undergrad students because I'm dealing with MBA students, and I have actually only taught master students. I mean, undergrad, like a seminar and so on, but as a course, I don't think I've ever actually taken an undergrad course. Now that you mention it, so it's basically at the master's level. But I mean, they're still young. I mean, they're like at the most of them are like 20, 21, and so on. So at an so I've been here at IMA for about 8 years. These are mostly engineers who are, coming to do an MBA. And among the many electives I take, one of them, which I'm most passionate about, is called the Hitchhiker's Guide to Business and Economies Across 5 Centuries, inspired, of course, by Douglas Adams. And a lot of cheesy references to the novel, throughout the course. So I think most viewers probably have heard of the book and the number 42, which is very central of the cult of Douglas Adams. So the assignment weightage in the course is 42%. The group work is another 42%. And the course mat on the cover, it says, "Don't panic." So there's a lot of Douglas Adams fiction kind of portrayed throughout the course. But the course is essentially about 500 years of business and economic history. And it also has social media handles. So if anyone's out here, there, it's on Twitter as BizEconHist and on Instagram as well, at the rate BizEconHist. And the social media handle is one aspect. And I realized it was an amazing archive of the course itself. So when students are making presentations, their essays. So now, along with the essay, I tell them to make a slide just summarizing. And the best ones kind of, then go on the page. And it's amazing also for me because, and also for students, many of them who slept through the course wake up, now they're at some multinational boring desk job, and now they're flipping through the Instagram or Twitter, and they're actually like engaging with this account. So I never, they didn't pay attention in class, but they're post course engagement. So that's been something which I didn't anticipate when I started the social media connect. Or when I tend to meet alumni and I know they've taken my course, I quickly zip through this to see what they wrote on, or just like a reminder to myself, and so on. But the course is very interactive. Of course, the readings are not necessarily very academic. So there's a bunch of academic readings and, again, synthesis books, non-academic kind of stuff. The class starts with like some amount of element of fun because it's essentially history. Again, you have to understand that history as subject is seen to be very boring in India, especially the schooling. So these are engineers who have not really done history since class 10, and they come into this class with this idea that, what the hell are we going to really learn in the class? So from my objective when I launched, I must mention in passing that when I first offered the elective at my economics colleagues level, a senior colleague basically said, what nonsense is this? what are we teaching next? Drama, theater, and so on. Which I'm so happy that we're also teaching, by the way. But this course is kind of done really well, touchwood, because it's beyond political history. So there's very little political history. It's something completely different. They're not really exposed to this. It's beyond India. That's the most interesting
I see that.
reason why students are taking it is because they get to learn a bit about Africa and Latin America and Europe and different parts of the world. Again, the social media connect, and the student projects. I think that's been my greatest learning because I'm sitting on a corpus of over 1,000 essays now. At least even if you say 100 or 200 of them are really good ones, a lot of effort. I've got to learn so much from them. I mean, and just to give you a range of topics, the history of contraceptives in India, that's one essay topic. The history of a particular company, the history of Pune's business center. I mean, there's just a range of topics which have come out. And in the two books I've written, I've both of them thank the students of this course
I see.
because I've learned a lot. And the student projects, the group project, one is an essay, but the group project, they've had to go out and just document a local business in Ahmedabad and what we call as oral histories. And they've done a remarkable job. And we're sitting now on a corpus of about 150 such oral histories. And my plan is to edit a book with their name, of course, as the title, which is basically like a small business history of Ahmedabad. Because these are like restaurants or dentists, or these are shops and businesses which have been around many cases more than 100 years, but on average 50 to 100 years. And it'll be a remarkable history of the city, which has actually been covered by these student projects. And of course, there's some structure, into it. They have to do these consent forms and they have to take it on tape and so on. And the people who give the interviews have to sign forms and so on. So there's some structure in the course. But I realized that I think most student projects, I guess it depends from discipline to discipline, but students sometimes do put in effort and do put in time. And my whole idea is, how do we make it again more accessible? I mean, this is also information. How do we start making it more accessible? And so to one extent, social media, but I thought, okay, maybe some of it can also go into like an edited volume of this thing. In this case, it works because it's like business history. It's something that documenting. So I've had a lot of fun, I must say. And I also teach courses like urban economics and macroeconomics and stuff like that. But this is really the course, I'm very passionate about. And I think that I've had a great time with students. And I'll just end this point by saying the word Hitch itself, right? So it's like become a brand on campus. The course, I mean, it's called Hitch on campus. But now I have two former Hitchians who are getting married. So they took my course. I don't know if they met there, but they're getting married. So just today, in fact, just 2 hours back, I speed posted, the Douglas Adams book, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, saying congrats on getting hitched yet again.
It's wonderful, wonderful. So apt, so apt.
Yeah, exactly.
No, hearty congratulations if you're actually watching this. These are the stories we live for.
Yeah, exactly.
To be very frank. In fact, that's probably one of the most important satisfaction, which cannot be captured through any metrics.
Yeah.
But it's going to live for a long time. I would also want to pick your brain on your writing process, because there is something for all the academics to learn here, because being an academic who does rigorous research and also write books which kind of pluck the interest of a slightly broader audience without having to compromise on the rigor, which I found it to be one of the most exclusive aspect of your work. Please tell us a little bit about that so that we get an overview.
No, it's one is, of course, practice. I mean, I tell all my students, and especially the PhD students out here, that like most things, I was not a good writer definitely 15 years back, and the first book actually was never planned to be a trade press book. And it again, that the contract just came in a very, again, serendipitous way. But there I had to write a book for a general audience for the first time. This is 2016 when I got the contract. And until then, for 8 years, I was trained in a very boring academic language, to write in a certain way. And I'd publish research papers, using that language and structure. And, and the first thing my publisher says, we can't publish tables and charts and stuff in the book. And I was like, what? Like, imagine not having a table or a chart. So I mean, I don't think I have a single research paper without a table or a chart. So I obviously you've read books like, say Harari or Jared Diamond, and obviously you're inspired by when you read that, you realize that, look, there is some amount of rigor in what they're doing, and they're also able to communicate you in a very nice way. So some of it is, of course, because I think I read a sufficient amount to know what engaging writing might look like. But literally the writing process is very, difficult, but it's always trying to think, is this something which a layperson can understand, right? And it is hard. It is very hard. And the migration book, went through a lot of reworking and reworking and reworking. I know there are a lot of anecdotes of that, famous book by Stephen Hawking, but and I had nothing so fancy to explain anyways. But even for such an arcane topic like migration, I would say it took a lot of, many trial and runs. And I would say in the writing process for a book, the editor does matter.
Yeah.
At least I lucked out on having a great editor. And as I said, the hallmark of a good editor is that they kind of, leave enough comments which enrich the book, but you don't even know how that happened as a writer, right? So they do enough to enrich the book, and you don't even realize that that's happening. And so she was, I mean, Swati Chopra was my editor. She's, absolutely fantastic. And I've kind of stuck to her. So she's moved across publishing houses, and moving with her. So I think that relationship with the editor is also important for the writing process, because they can really help you navigate. I mean, I would just ask, are people going to understand this? And she'd have a view, or or you ask up friends and so on. The other part of the writing process, take feedback. Just don't be shy to take feedback from family, from friends, and so on. When you write paragraphs, you write a chapter, get some feedback from people. That often helps. To write a 60,000-page book, one formula is, if you write 1,000 pages a day, in 60 days you can write a book. Now that's easier said than done, of course, but I think that now I'm at a stage after writing 2 books, obviously, that practice, that I feel if I really put my mind to it, I can put 1,000 words in a day. And of course, nowadays I'm writing like op-ed pieces only in like 2-3 hours, which I could not obviously do 10 years back. So that's just about practice. So having a broad structure in place, and the research, of course, is very critical. And then really knowing your audience is the general person out there, and how do you simplify this? I think that's the key. Having said that, once I wrote the first book, I remember writing a research paper, and I got a reviewer, and I ended the research paper with like a joke or something, something funny. At least I thought it was funny. And the reviewer picked on that sentence, saying, this is not academic language.
Oh,
I said, okay, they're completely different worlds. So
absolutely.
it's interesting. I mean, when I write an academic paper now, a research paper, it is, it's a different language altogether.
Yeah.
And this is a completely different world. So I'm sure I'm messing up a little bit on both. But that's the way it is, and I don't think either one is going to change or something. So I'm trying to take this middle ground and not make my research papers very, very academic either, and definitely not completely dumb down the trade press books to a point where there's really nothing in it. So it's a fine balancing act. And I must say that I read a lot of nonfiction, and I'm hugely inspired by many people who write far, far better than me. And hopefully someday I'll, I keep telling myself that, hopefully I need to get there where, like, these guys are operating at. For example, William Dalrymple, I mean, just the kind of stuff, the prose he writes with, it's just phenomenal. But of course, he's reached there after like 30 years of writing.
Exactly.
So hopefully someday try and get there. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, there's a great lesson for all of us here. What you mentioned. It's also very interesting because I found that even only in recent years, when I also have, of course, I've been blogging for a very long time, but if I have to now make an effort to also look at things such that I may want to put it together as a book, it is very useful to think in terms of the word counts too.
Yeah.
Because as an academic, I was never actually used to, especially in sciences, if you write in LaTeX and all, you will not be even looking at all these things. But I found that that's actually very useful, because the amount of time you spend on idea is very critical in papers, whereas you also have to spend time on the content, what you kind of write. In a book.
Structure, absolutely. I mean, both my books have a spreadsheet where the first tab is TOC, table of contents, and the table of contents has a column called word count, right? And literally, like, every chapter, the sub points and so on. And I mean, of course, you can be flexible with it.
Yeah.
But it's good to have some idea. I mean, if you're signing up for a contract of, say, 60,000, I mean, most publishers will give you a range of, say, 5,000, 10,000 words. So you can't sign a contract for 50,000 words and end up writing 100,000 words, or vice versa. So having some sense, and that is why then selection becomes so important, right? So you're going to write 60,000 words, and you have 100 years of history. Like, how do you do this? Do you go year-wise? That's not going to work. Geography, who gets more importance, and so on. So then it's all about selection. Once, especially synthesis kind of works, right? And I think good books kind of, I mean, one way of writing, especially books, is to have one central idea and then just hammer that in every chapter using different examples. That's I guess one way. And then narrative arc kind of books try and balance out, in a different. I think the broadly two kind of ways which nonfiction writing is work.
Wonderful, wonderful. So before we conclude, Chinmay, please give us a gist of your kind of projects, what you are now working on, what are the kind of questions you are now interested in.
Sure.
It need not be only academic aspect,
Yeah.
but it can be even a broader kind of questions. What you're, because I also know that you write op-eds, very
Yeah.
interesting ones. And also, I would strongly recommend to anybody who is slightly more general kind of reader, or anybody, to also follow Chinmay on Twitter. He posts some fantastic content there. I would strongly encourage you to have a look at it here.
Yeah, so there's one dream project of mine which I have not shared on any interactive session like this so far because I don't want to jinx it. But I think it is jinxed, because it's going nowhere. It's not yet in my back burner folder because I'm so proud of this project. But it's going to take many more years, right? So I'll drop it at that. But I've been working on this for the last 10. In fact, I was working on that, and the pandemics book just happened, So I put that this particular project on the back burner. So now I've spent so much time on this particular project, which shall not be named, which shall happen someday, that I've just started on a project which, disclosing it here for the first time, it'll be a book which will come out next year. And it's linked with science in a way. It's in a way a continuation of the pandemics book, but it's going to be a history of the pharmaceutical industry of India.
Wonderful.
So this is something which, again, started with a student, So a student who took my course on history and took another person's course on health. And we were chatting in a cafe, and he's now joined this health association. And I said, nobody's worked on the history of the pharma industry in India. And he said, sir, why don't you write it? And it's literally like, a conversation. If he had not taken my course on history, we would have never met. So now I'm working on this project. And it's looking at this industry. So I'm obsessed about pharma right now, medicines, and of course it's partly business history because it's about companies like Cipla, Lupin, and Pfizer, of course, Glaxo. India is the setting, and interestingly, India has it's huge part of the generics market in the world. So I'm looking at it from three broad prisms, I guess: science, entrepreneurship, and globalization. And trying to understand how India became like the world's biggest vaccine producer, or something. How do these capabilities kind of rise over time? And I'm seeing it actually in a strange way as a continuation of the pandemic. The pandemics book is called The Age of Pandemics, 1817 to 1920. And from 1921, every census, the death rate of India started falling. And one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons of that was better medicines, antibiotic revolution, this revolution, that revolution, and so on. And the pharma industry had some role to play in it. And the Indian pharma industry, there's also like an economic history and business history angle to it about how did these guys start these businesses. Pune, by the way, also features in this book, obviously. And of course, Hyderabad, which is the bulk drugs capital of India, Ahmedabad. So I would say 4 cities: Ahmedabad, Mumbai, Pune, and Hyderabad are important players in this story. So I'm obsessed about this project. So this is my next 1.5 years of life, is just everything about the pharma industry. And definitely making more trips to Pune to learn about NCL and a lot of the institutions in Pune which have supported the pharma industry growth. Yeah.
Wow. All the best. I'm delighted to actually know that this is a very interesting topic. You would also find kind of resonance across many disciplines, as you probably would be also interested in. And hopefully we'll also have a book talk at some point of time.
Absolutely. No, definitely. When it's out, have to come once again.
It'll be our pleasure to have you here. So finally, the last question, Chinmay, being a scholar, being a person who also is engaged in some kind of public debates, because I've seen you also on various different platforms where you talk to people who have a very, very broad kind of an audience, and also you are a professor at IIM. How is life if you look at from a slightly broader perspective, because as a scholar, we always have to think about this between the broad breadth and the depth, and how do you really manage, which is something which is significant, and I really admire that aspect of your work. Give us a gist of that before we.
Yeah, I think again it's I think till 2016 I was just just in put my head down in academia, and then 2018 rather, and 2018 the first book came, and well, the thing with trade press book is there is an element of ego. You see your books on airport shelves and so on, and suddenly you're like, like like people are actually reading you more than 5 people on your journal paper. Maybe maybe a few more hundred people are reading your book. So there is an element of ego, and that's why I still do peer review research, because that keeps your ego in check.
It'll bring us down
It
ground
brings
state.
it down. Exactly. Yeah. So that's very important. But so I think because the book put me out there, I think that's when I started getting more like, let's say I started tweeting more and started being more out there on social media. Partly, of course, because it helps the book, but also then I started enjoying that process. And you also, I mean, Twitter is a toxic place, but you also tend to learn a lot. So
Yeah.
I think I've learned a lot on Twitter over the last decade. So the public engagement also, I think there's two ways. What the book did was that more people hear about you and your work. And then I realized that the book is not the only way to do it. You can also be out there through writing newspaper articles, through various forms of engagement. So one of the things we've started is a history literature festival.
Yes, I was just about to ask that. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. So lots of interesting events. So now I'm enjoying that. And I must confess, one of the reasons I enjoy that is because it gets me out of academia for a little while, at least. So the History Literature Festival, for 2 days of my life, I get to meet like really interesting people, diplomats and bureaucrats, or any of these literature festivals. It's not really the festival per se, it's just the fact that you get to meet non-academics. Because, I live on the campus. So my life is exactly so we are both like in just complete like these cocooned academic lives, which I'm sure many of the listeners also might be able to relate to. So for me, this is a nice escape as well. I must say I love my academic life. It's not like I'm doing this because I don't like academia.
Yes.
I absolutely love academia. I love my job. I love. I'm also blessed to be at IIM. It's a great institution. So I find this public engagement also useful to kind of step a bit out of academia, which is useful also because then you don't take yourself that seriously. You don't. I think academics also can kind of get this self-serving, or you don't feel like you're doing something very intellectual and so on. And it's useful to kind of just be with different sets of folks who have many of them have no interest. Like they're like, what is academia? Like, what do you guys do? And I love that. It's like, I mean, sometimes it's good to just like try and just be put as a complete non-interest area from folks or like sports people. You meet sports people and they have no idea, like, say, do you earn enough money? Or you meet bankers and they're like, how do you like you earn money? What do you do for a living? And so on. Is that your main job? And stuff like that. So yeah, so I think the public engagement helps me also put one step outside. And the way I've done that is partly social media, partly writing newspaper articles, now the History Literature Festival as an event. And one of the things I'm really passionate about is archives. So also archives of different institutions, of organizations, and stuff like that. So of course I've not started anything of my own, but happy to be part of projects which are doing these kind of things. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. I wish you all the best for all the future ventures you want to actually take. And of course, hopefully we'll also have you sometime in Pune here, as we actually had during the History Literature Festival. That's when I actually met
Correct.
Chinmay. Of course, the meeting happened later in the IIM Pune campus. So thank you very much, Chinmay. You really have added fantastic, resonance to Pratidwani, so to speak. So I'm very thankful for your time and thoughts. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So this is Pratidwani, where we try to humanize science, this time with the one and the only Chinmay Tumbe. Thank you, Chinmay.
Thanks.